Okay, welcome to another episode of Headlines in History with your host, me, Jon Molik. Thanks for taking a little bit of a break with us here. We had a bit of an unexpected break. I had a lot going on in the non-podcast world, stuff we'll probably be talking about in the future, but we're still kind of in the mix, still dealing with some things and activated for some things. And if you've read anything about what's been happening in New York in terms of the prison strike crisis and the New York National Guard's response there, then I think, a little bit of what we've been dealing with. So, as always, right, work and family, they come first. And so the show doesn't fit at the top of the list there. So we had to take a little bit of a break. But here we are. So we're going to go back to OSS planning, Operation Spartan Shield. And last episode, we talked about the map. We talked about geography. We talked about what the Middle East looks like in the surrounding regions geographically. We talked about the countries, the nations. We also talked about the waterways and how the area kind of looks today and how it was developed. Today, what I want to do is I want to go back into history. Deep, deep history. Oftentimes historians call this time prehistory. Prehistory because there wasn't really any writing and in any official sense. There wasn't any languages. There weren't any languages that we can identify in its entirety. And so if we have artifacts that we find and we find sculptures and metal workings and things like that, archaeologist findings, we find spoons and forks and things buried under walls, then we can make guesses, logical and educated guesses as to what was happening, but we still kind of call it prehistory because we don't have any direct specifics until we get into cuneiform writing and those type of things. So prehistory into Bronze Age history, we're going to start. And, we could go for a long time. Obviously, history is very, very long, and it's very, very complicated. And that's not what we're looking to do here on the show. What I do want to do is just lay out some of the basics for those of you that might have not had the opportunity to travel to the Middle East. And even if you have, maybe provide a little bit of some generalized understanding that'll provide you some context, which I don't even think I really had when I went. The first time I found myself downrange in the Middle East in 2005, I think I appreciated in some sense that where I was going was older in a sense than the United States and anything I really understood from being at home. But I don't know if I really appreciated it the way that I should have. And so what I want to do today is point to some of those specific events or the time when quite literally civilization began, when humans started to coalesce into groups and transition out of the hunter-gatherer society. So you understand really how long people have been living in the Middle East and the surrounding regions and where the culture comes from. And so you're likely going to think back to middle school when we're going to talk about some of this stuff, because we're going to talk about the cradle of civilization, and that is often referred to as the Middle East. And again, you probably heard that when you were first in middle school. It just means it's an area that humans, again, like I'd said, began to coalesce around agriculture and transitioning from their hunter-gatherer behavior and lifestyle. So for many years, humans have been around for arguments anywhere between 100,000, 125,000, 250,000 years. People have different arguments about what is what. Youngest, earliest is probably 100,000 years. But for most of that time, we were just running around the savannah very in similar ways to other primates and looking to just survive. And we were moving as the weather moved, we were moving as the herds moved, and where the food went, we went. Eventually, though, we started to figure out that some of these plants and trees and food that comes from the ground and vines and other things can be planted, and if they have enough sun and water, we can kind of put them in one place And then we can gather all of this stuff, and we no longer have to be following herds of animals and following where the trees grow. We can grow our own. And this started to come together, at least initially, in the Middle East. Now, we talk about the Middle East as the cradle of civilization, as I had mentioned, but there are other river valley regions, they're called, that propped up, or popped up rather, across the world in and around kind of the same time. Okay, but they're all similar in the sense that they all come around, or they all find themselves around bodies of water. Water because it's needed in order to grow these crops. And so the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two rivers that, the land of the two rivers, as it's actually called, but the land of the two rivers in Mesopotamia, and now today Iraq and Kuwait, that funnel into the Persian Gulf, that was one civilization. And then we have others like the Indus Valley, the Nile in Egypt, Nile being a very calm and balanced waterway in North Africa. We have Mesoamerica, which is in the South America area, the Andean, and then the Huanghe in China, which is also along a large river area. So historians look back and say those are the places where humans kind of began to come together and transition from this hunter-gatherer to non-nomadic or agricultural lifestyle. And we, if you're a part of the Operation Spartan Shield mission, will happen to find yourself in just one of them, but one of the most famous, if not the most famous. And some of that is because we get a lot of our archaeological findings from this area and earliest forms of writing that we were able to understand. And it even comes before Egypt. So Egypt's really popular because we have the pyramids and all those things. But the pyramids came after what was the real oldest civilizational behavior, if you will, that came out of the Mesopotamian area. The oldest pyramids that are of most popular, most well known, they came out of like 2500 BCE. Okay. When we're talking about the earliest civilization, we're talking about 5,000 to 4,000 ish BCE. So almost 2,000, 2,500 ish years earlier than when the pyramids were built, where we had the first people coming around, in particular in the Middle East. It said, in the Middle East, as we talked about last episode, you have an idea of what this looks like. We're talking about Iraq. We're talking about Kuwait as the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flow into the Persian Gulf. This southern area here, this southern Iraq into Kuwait, was called Sumer, where the Sumerians had come together. Again, 5,000 to about 4,000 ish BCE is when we really first start to see humans coming out of the north in when I say north, I mean upwards into Syria, and then potentially even upward in the northern Iran area. I mean, we really don't know. Historians really don't know exactly where the Sumerians came from. There's even some conversation they came from potentially even northern Africa, and we'll talk about it in a second. But we don't really know kind of where. But we just know that they came from the northwest, and then found themselves, as they were following the water, down towards where the Persian Gulf is. The Sumerians are interesting in that they were the first to discover and invent a lot of the things that we use today. And when you think back to, okay, like what's the one of the things that we invented as humans that's the most important in history? You're like, well, who invented the wheel? Well, there you go. These are the Sumerians. They're known to have invented that, and the plow, the sail, pickaxe, like a tool that you can use to dig holes and help with your agriculture. Potentially even brewing with yeast and cleaning water, which is the whole reason that they used yeast in the first place. And then they were even a transition into astronomy and mathematics. So, as I had said, 5,000 to 4,100 ish BCE. This is the land of Sumer, southeast, where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together, and they find themselves into what we now call the Persian Gulf, southern Iraq, Kuwait area. And back then, there wasn't any large city in the sense that you would see it today, right? The the land was made up of basically like city states. And I guess in a way they're their own nation in the sense that they had their own little ruler and they had their own way of doing business, or nation might not even be great. State is probably a better way to think about it, more like the United States, because eventually, like in Sumeria, you're going to fall under this general emperorship when the Akkadians come down, and so there's going to be some generalized basic normal behaviors, but each state kind of runs its own thing. So more so kind of like the United States. But in some of the earliest ones in Mesopotamia, cities like Uruk and Balbat, Gershu, Nineveh, Samarra, you'll hear Nineveh, you'll hear Samarra if you happen to be in Iraq or if you're focusing on that part of the area in support of Spartan Shield. And some really, really civilizational changing behavior occurred in this area. Some fascinating stuff. So take Uruk, for example, southern Iraq. This is where scholars believe that the Epic of Gilgamesh was written. Now, if you've heard of this before, this is really the first ever poem ever discovered, and we now believe likely the first ever written. Again, based on what we've discovered so far. But so the Epic of Gilgamesh, fascinating. You can go online, you can read it. It's really interesting. This was found and likely written in southern Iraq. You know, the earliest forms of civilization, they're happening here now. The earliest forms of civilization are found right in this area. Many call where the Epic of Gilgamesh in Uruk is the first city in history. The first time a few thousand human beings had come together off the plains, living in a certain space, sharing water, sharing space, living in little buildings, mud hut buildings that are close to each other with only a street, if you will, separating themselves, coming together. This happened in Iraq. This is the first place we found the cylinder seal. So the first time, again, archaeologically speaking, the first time that we found a seal that has a specific drawing, specific annotations on it that says, this is my item and this is your item. Right? So I own this thing and you own that thing, and here's how we're going to delineate from the two. This is where we first find this thing. So, and you might, that might be obvious because you might think to yourself, well, the first time humans are going to come together, they're eventually going to clash, you're going to find these things. So that, it may go hand in hand, but still interesting nonetheless. The first stamp to signify ownership. And what you might be thinking, and as you should, is that eventually we're going to find ourselves, we'll talk about it in the future a little bit, we're going to find ourselves coming up with the first laws to help break or determine or answer arguments about, if I have my seal on this thing and I therefore claiming it's mine, but then now it's in your possession, what are we going to do about it, aside from just killing each other, right? Is there a more advanced, is there a more advanced way to deal with this? And we'll talk about it. So, and you can find some of this stuff, again, archaeologically, you can find this still today. There's a town, for example, Warqa in southeast Iraq, about 300 clicks south of Baghdad. That's the name of the modern city. It's close to the Gulf. You could visit there today. You could go there today. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And there's some guides that can take you around. It's a little heartbreaking because excavation wasn't done all that well. But nonetheless, you can go walk there and you can walk on the walls that were built now 7,000 years ago and think and know you're in the place that this is the first, house, if you will, the first town where anybody really lived. Now, as I said, the Sumerians, we don't really know exactly where they came from. We do think they came up from the mountains up north, and they definitely settled in the plains down where the rivers met, as I had said. A couple of different beliefs. I mean, there's some that believe, some historians, archaeologists believe that they are West Asian. We don't really know. What's interesting is that they did refer to themselves as the, quote, black-headed people, right? That's just they had darker skin and they had darker hair. And again, they referred to themselves as such. And then a little bit later, we're going to find another quote unquote civilization. The Akkadians come on into the story from the Northeast a little bit, and they referred to the Sumerians as the black-haired people. So this ties into this potential concept where the Sumerians may have found themselves coming north out of the northern Sahara, where they would match more, I guess, the black-headed people concept, and it was definitely greener in as you get further south out of the Sahara, and you can. So, anyways, I'm going to talk all day about that, but nonetheless, nobody really knows. They just know that they settled down into the plains. Now, another thing that is common that you'll hear throughout history, and is that definitely the same for the Sumerians, is they had their gods. Gods were often attributed to the unknown, and you can see throughout history as different gods relate to different natural behaviors and whether they are positive or negative. So, for example, if you have a god that relates to the sun, you will think that the god behaves in positive ways. It's light, it's energy giving, it's blissful, those kind of things. And then you have gods that relate to thunderstorms and rain and devastation. And there's gods like Ra specifically that tie to the Nile in Egypt, and the Sumerians had the same thing. They could not figure out why certain things happened in life, why people died, why the rains came, why they didn't come. And so they would just attribute these to these deities that, of course, they never saw, couldn't speak to or touch or any of those things, but they didn't understand it. But nonetheless, it allowed them to make sense of their environment. And so the Sumerians had their set of gods. They were all polytheistic, again, relating certain behaviors and naturalistic events to gods. And they were often anthropomorphic. So they would create images of these gods and they would give them either animal like or human like bodies. Anthropomorphic. They would be human-like, goddess of beauty, very similar to the way the Greeks and the Romans did things too. But a beautiful goddess would be drawn in a certain way, and an angry thunderstorm god may have, again, like a darker complexion and gruff and those type of things. And one of the other things that's interesting and specific, it's unique to the Mesopotamian civilization, specifically the Sumerians, is when you have your polytheistic gods, you have this idea that they're not here on Earth with you, at least on the ground level most of the time. So they're up higher, they're in the sky, they're in the stars, they're away from you. And so the best way to get close to these gods, to communicate with them, to try and to ply them for wonderful tidings and all these things, you got to get close, right? So in order to get close, you got to go higher. And in some early civilizations, they did this by going into the mountains. If you could climb this really tall mountain, then in theory, you'd be closer to the god. Well, they didn't have this in Sumer. They didn't have the Sumerians didn't have this. So they built things called ziggurats. And these were, opposite of the pyramids in Egypt, which were tombs, and they were used to put the dead inside for the passage between today's life and the afterlife. The ziggurats were the exact opposite, in the sense that the higher they built them, they were built so they could climb on top of them, and then they could worship their gods, whatever they were. And so there are some famous ones. One of the world's most famous is in Nasiriyah, and this ziggurat where the Sumerians would climb up and they would worship the gods. At the time, it used to be a coastal city, and so, obviously climate changes and water rises and falls. And anyways, it used to be a coastal city, Nasiriyah, and you can see where the ziggurat was close to the coast, and then go up and then they'd worship. And another interesting thing, too, moving on from the religious, so Sumer was pretty democratic from our current life perspective. You'd think, well, there were emperors back then, and they were singular leaders, and they had slaves, and so everyone just did whatever the boss said, in a sense, right? But each city-state in Sumer had its own councils. People would vote. They'd literally vote and make decisions as people what they wanted to happen within their city-state, and they would also do it when city-states came together. So if there were external tribes, and we'll talk about another group, the Elamites, who happen to live in the mountain regions, the Zagros regions of Iran, if they had come out from the mountains down into the Sumerian regions, and they were attacking or looking to sack city-states, take resources and these things, then the city-states would gather together. They would find their, middle level managers, if you will, or the people that led each city state, and they would vote and say, hey, do we need to come together as city states separate? You're over there and Uruk and Bilbot and all the, can we do this thing and try to fend off against the other who's coming across the mountains? We're these open land people here next to the Tigris, and then there's these people coming from the mountains. Can we do this thing? And they would vote on it, and they would join, and they'd appoint a military king for the time being, a temporary, and then they would conduct combat, and it'd have wars, and then it would break up. Really interesting stuff. Anyway, so tying back into the religion too, and so this is where I'm going to draw kind of a connection here to more recent history. And I know we're talking about BCE here, but more recent history is that the ideas and the mythologies that come out of the polytheistic mindsets, the polytheistic histories of this part of the world, is where you start to get some of the earliest connections in the Old Testament, which will end up being the most important religious book really in the history of the world, arguably, as it leads to the formation of the three great monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which of course is so impactful to what the Middle East in the Operation Spartan Shield landscape looks like today, is that some of these stories, a lot of the stories that you'll find in the earliest conversations, if you will, in Christianity, come out of these cultures. The creation story, the birth of man, the great flood, the hierarchy of gods, which even existed in the earliest forms of Judaism. We can maybe even have a conversation about this in another day in a religious episode or something, but Yahweh being the name, the title given to the earliest, we're getting a bit of theological here, but the one God for Judaism and even Christianity, that at one point in Jewish, at least secular Jewish understanding, is that Yahweh was one God of many others. And so anyways, this is where this hierarchy of gods comes from as well. The Jews just happen to have one, again, from a secular historical perspective. But anyways, so the hierarchy of gods, the idea of internal bliss and external suffering, right? The idea that there's a goodness in one part of life, there's bad in other parts of life, there's the suffering of life here today, then there's potentially external bliss, but then there's external struggle and internal bliss. So these are all moral and life deciding concepts that are starting to form as civilization started to form. And again, this may come to be obvious. You may think to yourself, well, all of these things would obviously come together. They'd necessitate out of humans being close, that you'd of course eventually have law. You'd eventually have decisions on moral and ethical behavior and things. Okay, maybe, but still, interestingly enough, that they're all coming out of here, and this is happening within the Middle East. The flood, for example, is likened from the common flood of the Tigris and the Euphrates in the area that would have seemed like the entire world. All right, let me give you a demarcation here between Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the Tigris and the Euphrates were very volatile, and the water coming out of the mountains to the north is what ends up feeding the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it ends up into the Persian Gulf. And cyclically, annually, the amount of water that falls, the annual rainfall, that makes it into the mountains, the snow melts, all of these things, and then ends up into the river. This doesn't happen equally every year. So there's times when there are loads and loads and loads of water. There's flooding all over the place. It's very challenging to determine and they couldn't, obviously. That's why they would relate it to the gods. But anyways, you'd have a bunch of water show up in the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then you'd have long periods of drought, and then you'd have more water coming. So anyways, the gods are playing with us, right? But anyways, you'd have this challenge where you were dealing with these varieties of the variables of the weather. And so it's very easy to think that the idea of a flood coming and flooding all of the crops and killing everything around you, you could see tie very closely into potentially the story of Noah, where the concept is it was flooding of the entire world because it was the world that they understood. The Sumerians only knew the people that lived around them. They clearly had no idea what was happening in Japan or anything else. So in their story, in their narrative, they would have the flood and they would relate it to the gods. It would be opposite from what was happening to the Egyptians that were living and growing up around the Nile, because the Nile was a very steady river. It was actually much easier to grow food, and there's discussions as to how the Egyptians eventually had the time to build the pyramids and the Sphinx and other things as the years went on, because they didn't have to worry so much about the agriculture. It was so common, right? So you'll find different gods. When I say common, I meant more regular. But when you find different gods in Egypt, you don't have these stories where you have the god who's angry about X, and so he sends all of the water, right? Because the Nile doesn't flood in that way. Locusts, connection between the Bible, connection between what's happening in Sumer. There were lots of locusts that ate the barley that grew along the waterbeds in southern Mesopotamia. Also interesting too is another city-state. I talked about Uruk. Well, there's another one, just Ur, happens to be in Iraq, and the Bible mentions Abraham being born in this city. Again, now this is a biblical understanding, but this certainly hasn't been disproven by any means, right? So if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, and you're walking around southern Iraq today, you could, in theory, visit the town of Ur, where Abraham, the father of all of the Abrahamic religions, was born. Some argue it wasn't in Ur. The Catholic Church believes it was in Ur. Whatever. Either way, interesting nonetheless. The point I'm trying to make here in this very early episode for history in terms of the region is that this is where civilization really started, the earliest of. And there are connections to the earliest behaviors within the region and what ends up happening to be the Middle East of today. Yes, Sumeria and the Mesopotamians are not the only ones. I talked about China and Mesoamerica and the Andean and stuff. There's others. And even locally, there are some others. There are the Elamites, who I had mentioned very quickly earlier. They're to the east. So if you remember episode 1, you have the basin area, the flatlands in southern Iraq and Kuwait. And then when you get east, you start to get into the Zagros Mountains. It creates this this separation rather between Iraq and Iran. You get over the Zagros Mountains, you find yourself in the Iranian plateau as you get east. You might imagine that those mountains create a buffer, a geographic buffer between peoples. And that's exactly what happened. You had the Elamites who lived in the mountain areas. Again, we don't know exactly where they came from, but they would eventually make themselves known by coming down off the mountains. They would head west, and they would get into these battles between the Sumerians. They had their own writings. They were sculptors and metal workers. Really interesting, the Elamites in particular, and they're talked about in the Bible pretty often. They had their own language isolate. So an isolate basically means that their language has no discernible connection to any others in the area. And so when you look at the grammar and the lines, and it's cuneiform originally, it doesn't connect to the language in Sumer, and it doesn't connect to Akkadian, and it doesn't connect to the Indus way further to the east. So it's like they don't know where it came from. Basically, is it possible that the Elamites created their own language separate and distinct from everybody else? But I mean, potentially, still haven't found a connection. Some believe there is an Indian connection way further east. So depends on how you study the language. Philologists study the language, and who knows? And so there's a belief that the Elamites might even have a connection from way east, and that's how they found their way into the mountains. And but whatever. A lot of things we still have yet to figure out. And like I said, the Egyptians are happening at the same time. The civilization is coalescing in the same way, in and around the same time. But again, the pyramids aren't built until a little bit later. And so the Sumerians, those that are living in Iraq, those that are around the Tigris and the Euphrates, they are the first of the first before anybody else. Okay, that's the beginning of the deep history. Next episode, we'll do another 30 minutes. We're going to talk about the Akkadians. We're going to get into Hammurabi and the Babylonians. We're going to start skipping a little bit because, again, like I said, we can spend forever talking about this stuff and getting really into the nitty-gritty. Don't really need to know all of that as you get ready for Operation Spartan Shield. What you need to know is the deep history. Everything started here, and now we'll start transitioning into Babylonia, and then we'll start to have some more connections to the biblical stories, which may have a little bit more of a you may have more of a reference to, and how this region all kind of came out and came about, and then we'll get into Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and really decide or discern how this whole thing came about. We'll eventually make our way into the 20th century, World War I and on. So, thanks for joining me. Deep history, Sumerians, Mesopotamia. Hit me up whenever you need. Headlinesinhistory.com. Email me at johnmolik@headlinesinhistory.com. Go ahead and leave any comments that you like on YouTube or whatever. Subscribe. That would be great. And thanks for joining me here today, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks.